So my part, we thought, okay, we're doing our quarterly update. What's going on? And gee, it looks like interest rates have started to go up on the mortgage market. That's typically where we noticed it first, and thought, well, what should we do? And so I thought, well, let's do a little something. Talk about what do we do when interest rates rise. So first, I want to start with some basics. And the first slide I have here shows what interest rates have done since 1950. So you'll notice it's sort of it's sort of a mountain chart, but you can see that there are long-term trends there. Those of us that were around for a long time remember when, this thing comes up, and good, shouldn't come back again. My apologies for that. The long-term trends here, and for those of us who've been around for a long time, remember what they were like back in 1980. So let's talk about a little bit about bond basics first. And I know some of you know more than others that are on this call, so I thought I'd just go back to the beginning. For those of you who already know this stuff, please be patient with me for a few minutes. So you also hear us use the term fixed income. That when we say fixed income and bonds, that's kind of interchangeable. And what is a bond? It's really just a note. It's an IOU. From who? It could be the U.S. government, and those are called treasuries. It could be from a state or a local government. It could be from a company. We call them corporate bonds. And it could be from a non-U.S. government or company. Usually we refer to as foreign or international bonds. There's also a subset of this, sometimes called emerging market or new market bonds. These are bonds issued by smaller countries. That doesn't mean third world backwaters. Many Central and South American countries, Asian, Eastern European, etc. It just refers to smaller economies. The other thing is, since a loan is usually pretty big from a government or a company wants to borrow, it's broken into smaller pieces, and those smaller pieces are called a bond. And the things to know about the bond is who is the borrower, also called the issuer, and sometimes just you'll hear people who work in this arena just refer to it as a credit. They'll just, when they say, well, how's this credit doing, they're talking about who's the borrower. There's also the amount of the loan, the interest rate, the repayment schedule, when it's due. Is there any security offered for the loan? And again, it's typically broken up into pieces, which are the individual bonds. Oh, and then there's the market. And interest rates do change over time, don't they? So when we think about issuing the bond, we want to think about what's the how sound is the borrower, how secure, how creditworthy are they. The better the credit, the lower the rate. We've seen that in mortgages and car loans or something when we make our own purchases as consumers, but the same thing holds true. And the U.S. government is typically called in financial research and studies the risk-free rate, and it's used as a benchmark to measure other borrowers' creditworthiness, and that leads to the interest rates that they're charged. So credit risk is one thing to take a look at in bonds. So let's take an example. We're going to play with this for a couple minutes. So let's say we have a note for $10,000 with a good creditworthy borrower. We're borrowing the money for 10 years, and the bond is held or is paying a 5% interest annually. So if you bought this bond and held it to maturity, you give them $10,000. Every year you get a check for $500 for 10 years, and at the end of that you get your $10,000 back. Pretty straightforward. But now let's look at, say, 4 years have passed, and the interest rate market has changed. And by the way, now you have a 6-year note. You don't have a 10-year note because 4 years have gone by. So when you say, what is your note worth at this given moment in time? Well, if you hold it till maturity, you get your $10,000 back. But what if for some reason you want to know the value of it today, or you want to sell it for any reason, and interest rates have changed? Well, what if rates had fallen to 3%? You have a bond paying 5%, and everybody else investing is given $10,000, and they're getting 3%. Your bond's paying 5%. Is it worth more? Yeah, it is worth more. How much more? Well, there's formulas for figuring that out, but it's certainly going to be worth more than $10,000. By the same token, if the opposite happens, what if rates rise to 8%? What's your 5% bond worth now? It's worth something less than that, because why should I buy your 5-year bond for 10 grand when I can get 8% with my $10,000? So your bond's going to be worth something less than the original $10,000 that you paid, because interest rates change. So that's called interest rate risk. So the longer the period until maturity, the greater the price or value changes for a change in market rates. So if I have a bond that matures in 6 months and interest rates move, I'm not going to have much of a change in price. But if I own a 30-year bond and interest rates change, because there's greater uncertainty further out there, I'm going to have a greater change in the fair market value of my bond. So the next thing I want to talk about is the coupon rate, or the stated rate on the bond. A higher coupon rate is less affected by changes in the market interest rate than a lower coupon rate. And I have an example here. Let's say there's a 1% change in the market rate. If I own a 4% bond, that's a 25% change in interest rates. So that bond is going to move in price quite a bit. But if I own an 8% coupon bond and the price and interest rates change 1%, well, this is only a 12.5% change, or 1/8. So you can see this is why a higher coupon bond has less risk to it than a low coupon bond. So what do I do with rising interest rates with this bit of information that we've just looked at? Well, I want to have a shorter maturity, and I want higher coupons. That is, a lower credit issuer. That sounds interesting. Well, so you might move from, example, government bonds to investment quality corporate bonds. So you would get a little higher rate of return under normal times with the corporate bond, and I might move to a much shorter maturity than I normally would have, and that should reduce the volatility to my bonds if rates rise. So here's two strategies. We manage our maturities, depending on what interest rates are doing. And the second one is we manage our coupons. In other words, we manage the credit quality of the issuer. We might want safer, or that doesn't mean we're taking crazy risks or anything, but we could, if you move from a AAA credit to a AA credit to a single A credit like that, you would expect some increase in rates for the same maturity. But that's not the whole picture. Let's look at another factor here, and it's called the yield curve. The yield curve is the relationship between interest rates at different maturities. So I tried to find a picture on the web for this presentation, but I couldn't find one. But I just have in my mind, I remember many times walking into a bank, and they would have a placard by the front door, and it said, 3-month CD, 6-month CD, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year, something like that. And you could see the different interest rates you'd get, and the longer the maturity, the higher the interest rates. That would be a yield curve for a CD from there. And this is a picture of a normal yield curve. On the left, we have the yield. Further up the line, further up the graph, the higher the yield. On the bottom, we have the maturities. You can see it, shorter maturity is a lower yield, and as we move up, so that would be what would be considered a normal yield curve. But that isn't how it is all the time. Matter of fact, for a lot of the last 5 years, it's felt like what we would call a flat yield curve, in that it didn't make any difference what the maturity was. We would, you get the same rate. So what we do is we call ride the yield curve. It's another strategy that we have, and that is if we have a flat yield curve, we're not paid to take any risk. So why go out of maturity? Whereas if we have a normal yield curve, going back to that slide, then we're paid to go out. And you can also see that it's not a straight line. It is a curve, in fact. So in this particular example shown here, it looks like it makes sense to go out to about 5 years. After 5 years, there's not a lot of difference in yield between a 5-year and a 30-year, where there's a lot of difference between a 3-month and a 5-year. So one of the other things that we do is our third strategy is we ride the yield curve. We manage where we are on the yield curve.